Have you ever noticed that some people seem to leave a shadow behind them, even after they've gone? Not a shadow in the sense of darkness, but in the sense of presence, a lingering outline that lives quietly in the corners of your mind. They are no longer there, and yet they are. Their absence takes shape, becomes almost tangible, as if the air itself remembers them. You find that you're not actively thinking about them, yet a certain song, a quiet moment, or even a stretch of silence makes them return, not in flesh, but in feeling. For a man, there are rare moments when a woman enters his life and, without trying, plants something deep in the soil of his psyche. She doesn't force her way in. She doesn't need to. It happens in the way she carries herself, in the rhythm of her voice, in the calm or the chaos she stirs in him without explanation. Something in her awakens something in him, something he may have never met before or something he lost long ago. And once it stirs, it refuses to go back to sleep. Carl Jung believed that every man carries within him a hidden feminine, what he called the Anima. She is not a single image, but a shifting, living force inside his unconscious. Sometimes she appears as the nurturing great mother, sometimes as the untamed muse, sometimes as the elusive shadow who both seduces and unsettles him. When a real woman steps into his life and happens to match the shape of this inner figure, the effect is not small. She becomes more than a person. She becomes a mirror for a forgotten part of his soul. And when that mirror is held up, even for a brief moment, the reflection cannot easily be unseen. Neuroscience explains why this connection feels so persistent. Emotional memories are not stored in the same way as neutral ones. They are etched into the nervous system through the work of the amygdala and hippocampus, through chemical signatures that carry the taste of experience. Dopamine writes the lines of desire. Cortisol sharpens the edges of alertness. Oxytocin seals the sense of attachment. Together, they create what could be called a neurochemical imprint. It isn't simply remembered in thought, it is remembered in the body. And here's the paradox. Sometimes the most unforgettable bonds are the ones that never find resolution. The Zeigarnik effect tells us that the brain holds on tighter to what is unfinished. It replays the open story, turning it over and over, seeking a conclusion that never comes. In this way, not talking again doesn't dissolve the memory. It deepens it. Silence becomes its own kind of connection, one that is harder to escape than the sound of words. This is not about mystical energies drifting between two people in some vague cosmic space. It is about how an emotionally charged connection is stored in the deep architecture of the brain and the subconscious. It is both science and symbol. It is biology wrapped in meaning. And it is why a woman can walk away and yet continue to live rent-free in a man's mind, not because she is magical in some shallow sense, but because her presence once fit into the exact empty space where his soul was asking for a mirror. Neville Goddard spoke often of imagination as the creator of reality. It shapes the world we see and the world we carry within. When a woman enters the inner world of a man in a deeply emotional way, she doesn't simply leave memories behind. She becomes part of the fabric of his inner reality. He may never say it aloud, and he may try to distract himself with other faces, other voices, other touches. But she remains, a quiet inhabitant of his imagination, where the laws of time and absence do not apply. And that is where her true imprint lies, in the place where he can neither fully keep her nor truly let her go. There are moments in life when we believe someone is seeing us clearly, yet in truth they are seeing something far older, an image formed long before we arrived. For a man, this image is not conscious. It lives beneath the surface, inside a quiet and unlit place of the psyche. Jung called it the Anima, the inner feminine he carries within himself, woven from the impressions of his earliest bonds, his longings, his wounds, and his unspoken dreams. When a woman appears who seems to match this hidden image, something profound happens. The recognition is not logical. It is not measured in compatibility, shared values, or common interests. It feels almost mythical. She seems familiar, though he may have never met her before. She's both a mystery and a mirror, both real and imagined. Without trying, she has stepped into a role he has been unconsciously waiting for someone to fill. Jung wrote that this is often mistaken for love at first sight, but what it really is is a reunion with the soul's own reflection. The man does not truly fall in love with the woman as she is. He falls in love with what she awakens in him, the lost, neglected, or idealized parts of himself. This is why her presence feels magnetic. It is not simply attraction to her body, her laugh, or the way she carries herself. It is an instinctive pull toward the part of himself that has been sleeping. But this kind of projection carries a strange and subtle cost. When a man projects his anima onto a woman, he stops seeing her as a separate, autonomous person. Instead, he experiences her through the filter of his own longing. She becomes the embodiment of his inner muse, his nurturing mother, or his elusive shadow. And as long as this projection remains in place, she is not just another person in his life. She is the keeper of a part of his soul. This is what makes her unforgettable. She did not set out to claim that role. She may not even realize she has it. And yet, simply by existing in a way that resonates with his inner image, she has touched something inside him that cannot easily be ignored. It is not about charm, strategy, or seduction. It is about resonance, a frequency his soul recognizes before his mind can name it. This resonance creates a duality. On one hand, there is deep desire, the sense that she holds the key to something sacred. On the other, there is discomfort, even fear, because her presence stirs parts of himself he cannot fully control or understand. This tension is why such connections rarely feel calm. They are marked instead by intensity, uncertainty, and an unshakable sense of significance. And this is where the hook lies, not in her actions, not in her words, but in the silent recognition that she carries a piece of his missing self. She is unforgettable because she is, in a very real way, irreplaceable. No other woman will match that exact shape within him. No other presence will awaken that same combination of longing and disquiet. This is not yet the full story, because the emotional imprint she leaves is not only symbolic, it is also physical, written into the circuitry of the brain itself. The connection moves beyond myth and into biology, where memory, emotion, and desire meet. And to understand why she lingers so powerfully in his mind, we must look at the way the brain encodes these intense encounters, a process that creates a lock far stronger than most people realize. That is where the next layer of this journey begins, in the place where chemistry meets memory, and where the invisible hook becomes something the mind cannot easily release. Once a woman has awakened the image of the anima in a man, the connection does not remain only in the invisible realm of the psyche. It begins to leave physical traces in the most intimate architecture of his brain. What starts as an emotional resonance becomes something far more enduring, a pattern that is literally wired into his nervous system. The human brain is not an impartial recorder of events. It remembers in proportion to emotional weight. Ordinary moments fade quickly, but moments charged with deep feeling leave behind a stronger imprint. This is because emotion acts as a signal to the brain that what is happening is significant for survival, identity, or meaning. And when the experience is intense, unpredictable, and carries the possibility of loss, the signal becomes even louder. Neurochemistry plays a central role in this. Encounters that stir strong emotion release a particular combination of chemicals. Dopamine fuels the sense of desire and anticipation. Cortisol heightens alertness, sharpening sensory impressions so that every detail feels vivid. Oxytocin forges a sense of bonding and familiarity, even if the relationship itself is brief. Together, these chemicals act as a kind of adhesive, locking the memory in place. What makes these connections even harder to loosen is their unpredictability. A relationship with steady, predictable rhythms leaves the brain at rest. It can be appreciated, but not necessarily obsessed over. But when the emotional current alternates between closeness and distance, presence and absence, the brain treats it as a puzzle it must solve. This intermittent reinforcement, moments of connection followed by silence, actually deepens the imprint, making the experience feel more significant than it might have otherwise. Silence, especially when it follows intensity, does not erase the connection. It amplifies it. The brain, deprived of closure, returns again and again to the memory in an effort to make sense of it. In this way, Absence becomes as memorable as presence. The very lack of resolution becomes part of the bond, as though the story itself refuses to be archived. And so, without deliberate intention, she becomes stored in his mind in high resolution. Not just as a passing thought, but as a vivid multi-sensory memory. The sound of her voice, the expression in her eyes, the feeling in his chest when she was near. These fragments are stitched together into a pattern that can be reactivated by the smallest cue, a familiar scent, a fragment of a song, even the way light falls through a window at a certain hour. This is the nature of the lock-in. Once the nervous system has recorded her presence as deeply significant, it will keep replaying her image, not to hold on to her exactly as she is, but to try to resolve the tension she awakened. It is this cycle of revisiting and reliving that turns memory into fixation. But fixation is not only a matter of memory, it is also a matter of dissonance. The mental discomfort created when reality no longer matches the narrative he believed in. And when that dissonance is tied to someone who stirred both longing and absence, it can grow into something much larger than the original connection itself. This is where we enter the next stage, when the mind, unable to reconcile her absence, begins to transform the memory into a persistent, almost unshakable presence. This is the territory of cognitive dissonance, where the emotional hook tightens not because of her actions, but because of the story he cannot stop rewriting in her absence. When a man experiences a bond that has touched him at the level of both symbol and biology, the mind expects it to follow a familiar arc: connection, deepening, resolution. But when that arc is interrupted, when the story does not reach the ending he unconsciously anticipated, something begins to fracture inside him. This fracture is not always visible from the outside, but it plays out quietly, insistently, in his inner world. Cognitive dissonance is the tension between what we believe should be true and what actually is. In relationships of deep emotional charge, this tension is magnified. He may tell himself that he can move on easily, that her absence means little, that the connection was simply a passing moment, and yet the echo inside tells a different story. Her presence still stirs somewhere in the shadows of his mind, and no amount of rationalization fully dissolves it. The more he tries to make sense of the disconnect, the more his mind revisits her, not as a conscious choice, but as an attempt to resolve the gap between his beliefs and his reality. The memory of her becomes a puzzle, one his thoughts keep circling back to without finding the missing piece. This is not the kind of thinking that fades with distraction. It is the kind that deepens in quiet moments, especially when the outer world grows still. Her absence is not neutral. It feels like a sentence cut off mid-thought, a melody that never resolves. This lack of completion is what keeps her alive in his awareness. Every time he replays the moments they shared, he is not just remembering, he is rehearsing, unconsciously trying to create an ending that will bring him peace. But peace never comes, because the ending he longs for exists only in the realm of imagination. What makes this process even more powerful is when she leaves without bitterness, without visible anger, without drama. This calm departure denies his ego the closure of a clean narrative. He cannot file her away under loss or conflict because there is no clear wound to heal from. Instead, she becomes a kind of open doorway in his mind, one he keeps glancing toward, even when he tells himself the chapter is closed. And so, the loop tightens. He tells himself to forget, but the act of trying to forget only draws her presence into sharper relief. He tries to redefine the story, but in doing so, he breathes life into it again. The dissonance feeds the memory, and the memory feeds the dissonance, creating a self-sustaining cycle that can persist long after the relationship has ended. This is why such connections can begin to take on a dreamlike quality over time. She is no longer entirely remembered as she was. She is partly imagined, partly idealized, partly reconstructed in ways that fit the unresolved narrative. And this blending of memory and imagination leads us to the next truth, that over time, she ceases to be simply a person in his past and becomes something more enduring, more symbolic. This is the threshold into the next layer, when memory resists replacement, when the mind cannot overwrite her presence with another face or another story. It is the beginning of memory reconsolidation failure, the point at which he moves from being a chapter in his life to becoming a structural part of his inner world. There is a quiet truth about memory that most people never stop to consider. It is not fixed. Each time we recall an event, the memory is subtly rewritten, altered by the feelings and interpretations we bring to it in the present moment. Neuroscientists call this process reconsolidation. In theory, it is how we heal, how we soften painful memories, how we adapt. But when a memory carries too much emotional charge and remains unresolved, this natural process begins to fail. In the case of a profound connection left unfinished, the mind does not treat the memory as a chapter to be gently revised. Instead, it holds it apart, as if placing it under glass. The event becomes frozen in its original intensity. It refuses to fade, because fading would mean letting go of something the psyche still believes is vital. Every time he recalls her, he is not reshaping the story, he is reliving it. The reasons for this are both emotional and biological. High-intensity experiences are stored with a kind of urgency in the brain, marked as important by the amygdala. This tagging tells the mind, do not lose this. And when the memory is paired with an emotional cliffhanger, the feeling of something incomplete, the brain locks it down even more tightly. The absence of closure keeps the neural pathways active, preventing the memory from being overwritten. This is why attempts to replace her with someone new often fail. The mind does not process the new relationship in the same way because it is still holding space for the unresolved one. The new person is compared, consciously or unconsciously, to the symbolic figure she has become. And because symbols are far more powerful than real people, untouchable, idealized, unchallenged by everyday flaws, no living person can match the version of her that lives in his inner world. Over time, she is no longer remembered in precise detail. Instead, she condenses into something more potent, a distilled essence of what she once represented. She is not just the woman he knew. She is the embodiment of mystery, tenderness, chaos, or awakening, whatever qualities she happened to stir most strongly in him. And because these qualities are not tied only to her, but to parts of himself he struggles to reach, her presence becomes an inner landmark. This transformation of memory into symbol is not a simple matter of nostalgia. It is the mind's way of preserving access to something deeply personal and transformative. The result is that she cannot simply be moved on from because she has ceased to exist in the ordinary sense. She has become part of his psychological landscape, an image that stands for more than itself, a symbol that now carries the weight of his unexpressed longing. And here is where the path turns again. Once she becomes a symbol rather than a person, her presence in his mind is no longer bound to the past. It begins to live in the present, reactivated not by deliberate thought but by the quiet triggers of life itself. A smell, a color, a fragment of music, the shape of a shadow in the evening light. These moments do not simply remind him of her. They awaken her as if she were still woven into the fabric of his daily reality. This is the threshold into the final evolution of her imprint, the moment when she is no longer just a memory, but an archetype in his personal mythology. It is the psychological echo, a phenomenon that stretches beyond the boundaries of the relationship and into the architecture of his inner life. And that is where the story deepens once more. There comes a point when memory stops behaving like memory. What was once a series of moments grounded in time and place begins to dissolve into something more abstract, and in that abstraction, it becomes stronger. She is no longer simply the woman he knew. She becomes a symbol, a living metaphor for something he cannot quite name but feels everywhere. Symbols are powerful because they are elastic. They stretch to hold whatever meaning the psyche pours into them. In his mind, she might become the embodiment of tenderness he cannot find elsewhere, the chaos that once jolted him awake, or the mystery that keeps him restless in quiet hours. She may hold the shape of the great mother, the nurturer, the protector, the one who sees him without judgment. Or she may take the form of the elusive shadow, the part of himself that frightens him and fascinates him in equal measure. This transformation is why she is so difficult to release. A person can be forgotten, a symbol cannot. The psyche does not discard symbols. It works with them, returns to them, allows them to resurface again and again in dreams, in stray thoughts, in moments of deep solitude. And because her image now carries this symbolic charge, every reminder of her becomes more than just a reminder. It is an activation. Certain triggers, a song, the way light spills across a floor, the texture of a certain fabric, can stir the symbol without warning. In those moments, he is not simply remembering her. He is touching the deeper qualities she represents. And because those qualities are connected to parts of himself he struggles to embody, the longing is not just for her, but for himself. Jung understood this intimately. He wrote that projections carry a numinous quality, an almost sacred feeling that lifts them above ordinary experience. Once a woman is invested with this numinous charge, she cannot be treated by the psyche as just another figure in the past. She stands instead at the threshold between the conscious and unconscious, between the self he knows and the self he is still trying to meet. This is why he can feel her presence even in her absence. She becomes a quiet constant, a figure who seems to walk beside him through moments that have nothing to do with her directly. Her absence becomes a kind of presence. She has entered the architecture of his inner world, and once she is part of that architecture, her influence is no longer bound to memory or desire alone. It becomes structural, shaping how he sees himself, how he relates to others, even how he measures intimacy. At this point, her presence in his mind is no longer something he is trying to hold on to. It is something he could not remove, even if he wished to. This is the place where psychology and biology, myth and memory meet. The symbolic charge she carries is sustained not just by emotion, but by the neural pathways that have been built around her presence. And this convergence sets the stage for the final truth, that she has become part of his inner architecture, both as a symbolic mirror and as a neurological trace. By the time a woman has crossed the threshold from memory into symbol, her presence no longer operates as a passing thought. It becomes embedded in the very framework of his inner life. She is no longer an external figure moving through his world. She is now an internal presence, shaping it from within. And in this way, she becomes part of his architecture, a fixture not easily removed without altering the entire structure of who he is. In Jungian terms, this happens when a projection is activated but never collapsed. If he had been able to fully merge the image of her with the reality of who she truly was, to reconcile symbol with flesh, the projection might have dissolved, freeing him to see her in an ordinary human light. But when she remains autonomous, untouched by his attempts to define her, the projection holds its shape. She becomes a living archetype in his unconscious, one that continues to influence him whether he wants it to or not. What makes this influence so persistent is that it operates on multiple levels at once. In the psychological realm, she is the mirror of his own lost or unclaimed parts. In the neurological realm, she is encoded as an emotionally charged pattern, a network of synaptic connections that light up whenever anything even remotely associated with her appears. Together, these levels create a double lock, symbolic significance fused with biological imprint. Joe Dispenza speaks about how emotionally intense images, repeated in thought, form a neural signature, a literal physical trace in the brain. This is exactly what happens here. Each time he replays her in his mind, consciously or unconsciously, the neural pathways around her image grow stronger. She becomes not just a memory, but a familiar neurological pattern that his brain returns to, as if it were part of his baseline reality. This is why she can still feel present years later, even if they never spoke again. She's not haunting him in the way the world might imagine. She's simply part of the scaffolding his psyche has built around certain needs, longings, and awakenings. Removing her would mean dismantling more than just a memory. It would mean restructuring an entire way of seeing himself and the world. And so her presence lingers. Not as an obsession he actively feeds, but as a quiet, structural truth inside him. She is the unspoken room in his inner house, a space he can enter without realizing, a sanctuary or a shadow depending on the day. Her image, her essence, remains fused to the deeper currents of his inner life. This is not magic. It is not simply about attraction, energy, or fate. It is the intersection of archetypal projection, emotional imprinting, and the way human memory binds itself to what is left unresolved. It is why some connections, even brief ones, do not fade. They are not just lived, they are built into the architecture of the soul. And this is why, no matter how far the years stretch, no matter how many faces pass through his days, he may still find himself returning to her. Not because she holds him captive, but because in some quiet, unchanging way, she has become part of who he is.